Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action to create and rebuild more resilient and inclusive economies and societies around the world. With me, Nigel Lake in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in San Francisco. And welcome to the July Green Jobs Report. A very good evening to everyone in Africa who stayed up late to join us, and Europe also. A very good morning to those who've got up early in the Asia Pacific region. Of course, good afternoon to everyone here with us in the Americas. Now, an awful lot of water has flown under the bridge since the whole coronavirus crisis started some 4 or 5 months ago. I just thought I'd play here a report from February time when it all seemed like a distant problem. Of course, since then, there has been dramatic impact economically. I think everybody in this discussion will be well aware of the US jobless numbers, which have been pretty shocking. And of course, what has happened as that first wave of healthcare impacts has happened is there has been a first wave of economic activity or fiscal response by governments. I'll maybe just zoom this picture in a bit so you can see some of these figures. The big point of this chart is that they are all very large numbers. The other thing that we have seen now in more recent times is second wave outbreaks becoming established. This is a log scale chart. So of course the figures down the bottom are much smaller than the figures up the top, but nevertheless, you can see very clearly these second wave outbreaks becoming established. So this of course begs the question, where and how should fiscal stimulus as a second round of that comes through, or in some countries, perhaps it's a third and fourth round, which jobs should we be trying to support, which industries should we be trying to support, where are the best opportunities for investment by government and indeed prospectively by the private sector. And just as a final comment here, one thing which came out in our discussions preparing for today was the quote, should countries be trying to restart their economic engines, or should they be trying to start completely new economic engines and rethinking where their focus is entirely. So with that as introduction, I will hand over to Paul Herman. Please do introduce yourselves to each other in the chat function. Please do share this. Please do ask questions. If you put them in the Q&A, we have a better chance of getting to them. And with that, I will hand it over to Paul.
Great. Thank you, Nigel. Welcome, everybody, to ESGX. Good to have you back for our now 4th monthly Green Jobs Report in partnership with the University of Missouri, Kansas City and the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. So look forward to having a deeper dive discussion on what the green job resilience is status is currently and ideas for policy. So feel free to use the chat box both to ask questions of the panelists and to share your ideas on if you could architect green jobs policy, especially based on the information you're going to hear today. What sort of policies, laws, incentives, regulations should we consider, both to boost GDP and to boost, more importantly, well-being of everybody, to have high quality, high paying jobs. So before we get to the Green Jobs Report, I want to kick it off with Kurt Lieberman. He's the CEO of Magni Global. Magni Global is an investment management firm that focuses on governance of countries. They also offer religious-based portfolios for the Jewish faith, Islamic faith, and Catholic faith. So Kurt, if you can turn on your camera, and Nigel, if you could fire up the slides, that would be great. And then after Kurt gives an overview on what's happening with countries and country-based ETFs in relation to COVID, we'll go deeper with Amir Kalagi, Dr. Scott Fulweiler, Dr. Fadel Kaboub with our Green Jobs discussion. All right, Kurt, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Nigel, as well. Hello, everyone. Glad you've joined us wherever you are in the world. Magni looks at governance. We think about governance, we build portfolios based on governance. And as the pandemic broke out, we wanted to understand the role of governance in pandemic response. For context, this map that you see shows the countries of the world that are in our top 10 and bottom 10. We focus on the countries that are called investable. Investable means their equity markets are open for international investors to participate in those markets. Currently, there are 49 such countries of the world. The top 10 are listed in the blue box on the left. I don't think there'll be many surprises there. The bottom 10 are listed on the right. What you'll see as one of the primary sources of difference is transparency. Countries that are transparent and open tend to be better governed, and those that are opaque, which often is a cover for corruption, tend to be poorly governed, and they're listed on the right.
And Kurt, just to be clear, the worst rated country are the bottom ones on the right, and the best
Correct.
Ones up on the left.
Yep. Thank you. Those are in sequence. So currently our number 1 country in the world is Canada, number 10 is Belgium, and number 40 is China, number 49 is Qatar. So yes, thank you, Paul. So with that, we began to look at COVID, and we looked for a data set that would tell us about the quality of a country's response to the pandemic. And there's a wonderful resource that I'd like to show you, and that's on the next slide, which you can see. This is the Global COVID Index, and I believe the URL for the site will be posted in the chat box so you can look at it. It is a marvelous site. I had nothing, nor my company had anything to do with building it. We do provide some informal advice to people who are involved in it, but nothing formal. It ranks the countries of the world from a purely healthcare perspective on how they responded, in terms of the severity of the cases, in terms of how they applied medical resources, and how they managed their populations. From an organization based in Malaysia, they've collaborated with a wide range of resources. And if you go to the website, you can see all of their partners. And I encourage you, if you're interested in the topic, to pursue it further. For what it's worth, the US ranks well below 100. Our rank varies day by day. It's been as good as about 120th and as bad as 132nd out of 184 countries that are ranked. We took that ranking and said, people look at healthcare. There's also a lot of economic damage going on around the world that the pandemic has induced. And what is the relationship of the healthcare impact, the country response, and the economic damage? There are some folks, particularly in the United States, that claim that a more aggressive medical response to mitigate the impact of the pandemic is harmful to economic vitality and hence hurts workers, particularly the working poor and people in customer service jobs. So there's many metrics that you can use to measure the economy. One that we looked at was stock markets. Now I know that's different than jobs, but we looked at it because it's a pretty good forward-looking indicator. In other words, it is an indicator of what people expect in the future. So with that, if Nigel, you could go to the next slide. What I'd like to do is explain this. We took the countries of the world that have an investable instrument where you could buy a share in a fund that represented the entire equity market. There are 45 countries outside the United States that have such a fund. In the US, they're called ETFs, or exchange traded funds. We took those countries and sorted them based on their response ranking in the Global COVID Index into two groups, the top 22 and the bottom 23. So the top 22 are the countries that did a better job purely from a healthcare perspective in reducing the impact of the pandemic in their country, and then obviously the other 23. We then created a hypothetical investment. It's a hypothetical investment, but it's one that really could have been made because we're using ETFs, which an investor could have then purchased. We said, what if someone bought equal amounts of each of the countries in the two groups, the top 22, the bottom 23? How would those two investments perform over recent periods? So we used from the beginning of this year through June 30th to represent the period of the pandemic. And as you can see on the chart, the 22 countries with a better response from a healthcare perspective to the pandemic massively outperformed the countries with a worse response. To me, what that says is the argument that an aggressive response to the pandemic from a healthcare perspective is not damaging to the economy. The damage to the economy is the pandemic. And if anything, an aggressive response from a healthcare perspective to the pandemic may actually be helpful to the country. I would not describe that as a hard conclusion because the data is still evolving. It's something that we're tracking every month. I will point out that since we started tracking this, the response has been getting stronger. In other words, the gap between the two groups is growing, not shrinking. Now, we tried to look at the next level down. Okay, what is it that caused those 22 countries to do a better job than the other 23? We looked at things like education of the leader, and whether, for example, did they have a STEM education, some sort of technical degree or medical degree that might give them better insight into the pandemic. That didn't matter. We looked at whether or not they were economists. That really didn't matter. The thing that mattered is something that's been out on social media. So Nigel, if you go to the next slide. It's a fairly simple thing that I think those of us like me who are men tend to overlook. Women leaders are considered to have done a better job than men leaders. And some of you may have seen out on social media various memes about that. Well, we took that and said, okay, does the data support that? And I would submit in two very powerful ways it does. So if you go to the next slide, these are the 8 leaders in those countries. By the way, Carrie Lam in Hong Kong, when you invest internationally, Hong Kong is considered separate from China from an investing perspective. All 8 of these leaders are in countries that are in the top 22. There are 0 female leaders in the bottom 23 countries. So it's a so far it's a, from a statistical standpoint, it's 100% perfect indicator that a female leader has produced a better COVID response. In addition, the countries, the equity markets associated with those 8 leaders massively outperformed, even larger than the earlier numbers. The difference is over 12%, 1,200 bips if you're in the financial services industry. That is a huge difference in performance. So female leaders are associated with a better medical response to the pandemic and far better economic impact on the country, much less economic damage. I think that's personally very interesting information and could well provide insight as to how to address this. How do we restart the engines? Part of the engine is having a good pandemic response so that you have a stronger economy from which you can do good things in the green economy and overall so that the well-being of your citizens are hurt less and hopefully lead to much better futures for everyone in every country. So that's the stuff. Paul, if there's questions that I should be addressing, happy to, or we can turn it over to the broader discussion.
Yeah, so just a quick question is, so these ETFs can help be an international diversifier. So if you're looking for a global portfolio, that's something for you to consider. And the countries that are engaged here, do you know, so like in the US, there's a big Federal Reserve push to support the capital markets so that the stock market looks disconnected from the economy. Is that happening in these other countries? Are they also getting that type of support, or is it the fundamentals that are leading it? Do you know?
It's a mix. It's a mix. China's doing a bunch. China also made it a patriotic obligation for all of the Chinese equivalent of day traders to invest in their stock market, which created some froth. It varies. Europe's been a little slower to the table than the US has. They have a much more complicated decision-making mechanism, although they passed the 750 billion euro stimulus package, which has the first socialized debt across Europe, which is an interesting element. So many of the smaller countries are having a tough time doing that. many of the emerging market countries already have significant debt problems. And if you're a smaller country and you're offering debt, typically you float that in dollars, not in your local currency, because that's what people want. And that can create a risk for you. So it's tougher for them to have those sort of interventions.
Got it. And if you're aware, and then we'll go to Amir after that. So in the US, frequently, this happened after 2008, of course, after 2001, some of it's happening now. There's layoffs. In Germany, after 2008, for example, everyone took a pay cut. There were few layoffs. There were pay cuts, but not job cuts. Is there anything common around, because some of these countries have more parliamentary systems, some have sort of socialism as one of the political parties. So is there anything in common around the leaders versus the laggards there?
I think it's easier for countries that have a broader safety net. If you compare, for example, the US versus Europe, our safety net tends to be cause specific as opposed to systemic. And as a result, since it's cause specific, it doesn't necessarily kick in these tough times, and additional legislation has to be passed. And so in addition to the pay cut, some of that existing in place safety net creates a more responsive situation that doesn't require legislation. And it also kind of sidetracks some of the current conversation. For example, here, we ramp up these cause-specific programs, which inevitably create opportunities for fraud. And then there's a bunch of articles about the fraud, but the fraud is created because we tried to ramp up something new that wasn't in place, and we tried to do it really quickly to be responsive. So there's a set of complex dynamics there. I think the other variable to take a look at is the degree of lockdown in the countries. When you have a weak response, you tend to be forced into tighter lockdowns because you don't have the testing regimen, the contact tracing, and some of these other techniques. The South Koreans, it's too early to say, but we may well look back and say South Korea probably did it better than anyone else. Very aggressive testing in the early days, very aggressive contact tracing. And instead of closing down businesses, they helped businesses quickly put in social distancing technology, simple things like plexiglass or plywood. So the cafeterias put up plywood to protect workers from each other so they could continue to work.
Got it. Great. All right, so great deep dive. Thanks for leading this, Kurt. I haven't seen anything like this, and that's why it's getting picked up in both the media like Barron's, as well as the Folio Financial Network and First Affirmative.
So thank you.
So yeah, thanks for doing that. Okay, so we'll bring Kurt back for the group discussion later. So Amir, you want to come online here? I'll fire up Amir's slides for the Greene Jobs Report, and we'll take a deeper dive. Over to you, Amir.
Awesome, thank you, Paul. So for those of you who are just joining us, our Greene Jobs Report, which we've been doing for the past 3 months since April, we analyze trends in industries with varying human impact plus profit ratings. All right, here we go. So, right, as I was saying, so we analyze trends in industries with varying human impact plus profit ratings. These HIP ratings are based on scores for performance, products, and management practices, which include metrics on health, wealth, earth, equality, and trust, with a focus on people, planet, and trust. From these company ratings, we map it to industries that are contained within the current employment statistics survey. And then the industries are rated based on an employment weighted average of the HIP ratings. The purpose of our report is to measure the direction and momentum and changes towards a greener, more sustainable economy. So for a quick snapshot of the various rated industries, you would be able to see in the highly rated industries, industries such as wholesale distributors, recycling services, and cleaning manufacturers. For moderately rated industries, you'd see pharmaceutical manufacturers, hospitals, insurance agencies, and for the most extractive the most extractive industries, lowest rated industries, you would see industries similar to oil and gas extraction or gambling industries. So diving into the report, a consistent trend over the past 3 months is that we have found that greener industries have been more resilient to job loss over the course of the COVID impact. So what we're looking at here, this is a chart showing the percent change in employment for each human impact plus profit interval. And looking at the greenest industries, right, we have significantly less reduction in employment as compared to the extractive industries, with the most extractive industries containing the highest proportional job losses. So for the next slide here, this is a month-to-month breakdown of the various human impact plus profit intervals. And we can see that the story of resilience for greener industries remains the same. Consistently throughout the entire COVID impact, we can see by the rightmost column that greener industries have been more sustainable and more resilient to the impact of COVID, with the most extractive industries having the most severe impact for job loss. With that being said too, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. We unfortunately experienced pay cuts throughout the entire economy for May and June, and this is directly following a substantial increase in April. So in May, we had a record decrease of around 1% for the private sector employees. And in June, it was followed by another record decrease by 1.17% for private sector employees. These pay cuts were experienced throughout the entire economy, which included the green industries. And if you guys remember from our last report, right, we can go on to the next slide for this point. So this is taken from our last month's report, and we indicated that there was a substantial increase in employment, but this was significantly due to the loss of lower wage, lower quality jobs. And as we pointed out, the greener industries with higher HIP scored jobs saw the lowest increase in wages, and this was because of the proportion of lower wage jobs was less, so the loss of lower wage jobs weren't as much as compared to the extractive industries. So how did the pay cuts affect green jobs? So we can see here from this chart that across the board, average hourly wages decreased by a record amount in May, and they will continue to decrease as shown by the preliminary June numbers. For the greener industries, we still see a higher percentage, or around over 1% decrease in pay, but we see that the most extractive industries had the lowest decrease in pay. But in terms of overall pay, which is shown on the next slide, greener industries still significantly outperform the extractive industries in terms of quality of pay and amount of pay. So although pay cuts were seen to affect the higher HIP rated industries, they continue to still pay more, and the most extractive industries still continue to pay the least. So another subject switch is that last report we looked at high context sectors, which high contact industry sectors are defined as occupations which require work to be within an arm's length of another. Our definitions of high contact versus low contact is taken from a study from the St. Louis Fed, which was published in early April. The link is featured below. But it pretty much used the ONET database, which contained information on the requirement for distances based on other occupations. And then we had mapped those to the industries that were contained in our Green Jobs report. And what we had found is that industries with a higher HIP score were less likely to lose their jobs, even in the high risk, high contact industry sectors. So what this chart is showing here is that within high contact industry sectors, greener jobs were less likely to be lost for both high contact and low contact industries. So we can see here that for industries that scored below a 30 on their HIP ratings, they across the board had more significant job loss in both high contact and low contact. So, and you know, this is shown here by the graph, seeing the you know, significant differences between the industries that were above 30 versus below 30. But what this shows is that consistently, regardless of the situation, regardless of the risk of the industry, when compared between higher HIP rated industries and lower HIP rated industries, the higher HIP rated industries were always resilient as compared to you know, lower rated industries. As our final point, we wanted to bring light on the healthcare sector, right? And some of the, I guess, more odd patterns that are displayed within the healthcare sector. So since February, the healthcare sector has lost about 1.4 million jobs. But what this graph is showing here is the decline in general hospital employment, which seems counterintuitive since we are under a you know, health pandemic. But you'd assume that, you know, healthcare services, hospital employment, it would remain stable, but that hasn't been the case. And more interestingly is that by looking at the jobs report, you would notice that there has been somewhat of a bounce back in May in terms of employment, but industries within healthcare, specifically general hospitals, have continued to decline in May, with a loss of, you know, 140,000 jobs since February. And what's odd about that is you would think, right? You would think that it would stay stable, but they're losing a lot of business in terms of elective surgeries, right? No elective surgeries, demand for elective surgeries are going away. In terms of pediatric health, people are weary of visiting the hospital, going to their normal services of like general checkups, and it's taken it's steadily impacted the employment within that sector, which one would think is the most secure. So
Great. So very insightful, deeply insightful, Amir. And so each month you're finding new unique trends related to COVID. Are there other things that are popping up yet, or things you want to explore going forward?
So two things. One thing, although we are finding, you know, new things to analyze and new facts that come about, one thing that consistently pops up is the resilience of the higher HIP rated industries. And the most interesting find was that even in high contact industries, when comparing, you know, the higher or the ratings amongst the high contact industries, you'd expect, you know, oh, they're all high contact, they'd lose their jobs regardless of you know, how they're rated, but still, you know, the higher HIP rated industries, you know, we're still resilient. And that might be something said within the rating itself, right? How the companies practice their management, their responsiveness, they're attuned to, you know, helping out, you know, people, health, trust, you know, those types of pillars. So they might be quicker to respond and more attuned to adjust towards the crisis situation itself. In terms of moving forward, I guess this kind of goes towards the general discussion of whether we restart the economic engine or, you know, create a new engine entirely. And, you know, the thing that I'm most interested in is that a Green New Deal, a new green initiative, we could create a foundation of jobs that hit all corners of the economy. And by all corners of the economy, I mean it would help out everybody with no matter the skill level, right? No matter the educational requirements, there can be jobs found there for everybody. Like, for example, like recycling job creation, consultants, you know, green maintenance, inspectors, regulators. And with creating this foundation of jobs that are supported by the government, from that, it would create, you know, millions of indirect jobs supporting that sector as well, in terms of like, you know, you're going to need financial managers, you're going to need engineers, you're going to need sales managers for all these, you know, green initiatives. Think about transportation that would be uptick, but again, it's anchored to a proven resilient sector, right? So it can be even in, you know, at least my lifetime, right? The huge, you know, humongous crisis, it still remains sustainable and resilient towards these things. So if we were to able, you know, to Kurt's point, rather than having the spill happen and then trying to figure out how to clean it up, if we had measures, right, to support against these, you know, unforeseen events, we'd be able to quickly respond and soften, you know, any type of economic impact.
Right. No, and that's what we found too, is that the risk-adjusted return or the total shareholder return of higher HIP-rated entities is generally higher, and lower HIP-rated entities is generally lower. And one of the reasons, the sort of themes, is that people are treated as an asset. People create product, people work in teams, people serve customers. And if you care about your product lifecycle, if you care about your team collaboration, if you care that customers are not just transactions, but relationships, those are the stronger companies, and those have more resilience in this time. Let's bring everybody together. So thank you again, Amir Khalegi of University of Missouri, Kansas City. Excellent Green Jobs report for July. Also joining from University of Missouri, Kansas City is Dr. Scott Fulweiler, and from Denison University and the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity, Dr. Fadel Kabout. And Kurt, feel free to join us as well. Kurt, CEO of Magnite Global. So Scott and Fadel, what does this mean for green jobs policy? Is there, Amir showed that hospital unemployment, employment is declining, or unemployment is rising in the hospital sector. That sounds very counterintuitive. Couldn't some of these people, even if they were working in administration or finance or elective surgery, do something to help respond to COVID? Is there policy or incentives we need to create? Don't all jump in at once. Fadel, you're on mute if...
No, my mic was off. Sorry about that.
All right, go for it.
Same thing.
Thank you again, Amir. Excellent presentation. So to pick up on the theme of resilience and on the concept of, you know, changing the engine of the economy as opposed to restarting the same engine, there's a couple of things. One is, you know, if you look at what climate scientists and what public health experts have been saying is that we know that with climate change, we will see more pandemics in the future. So this is not going to be a one-off. So this shock that we experienced over the last few months is something that we need to prepare for on a regular basis. And one of the things that this pandemic has exposed is, number one, the public health lack of preparedness that we've seen around the world, although with varying degrees of responses. And number two is the economic effect globally on specifically on supply chain and on particular industries. And if you look at the global south in particular, it's the food supply chain, it's the access to medical equipment and medical resources, and the tourism industry, which is a huge source of revenue and job creation for many developing countries. So this is the moment to rethink the dependence of your economy on particular industries that are susceptible to these massive shocks. And it's clear that this pandemic is not over, and the second wave is happening. So you can maybe muddle through without your tourism industry for one season, but can you do it for several seasons back to back? Maybe you can muddle through with a little bit of external loans, but can you really continue on this path as a developing country? And here we're talking about dozens and dozens of low income and middle income countries that are really struggling through this. So coming back to the US in terms of what we're seeing in the healthcare industry in particular, as Amir highlighted, you have a decline happening in terms of jobs in the healthcare industry for logical reasons, as Amir explained. People are avoiding hospitals as much as possible. People are skipping their dental cleaning appointments and regular checkups, which is forcing especially smaller independent practices into financial difficulties. And this is allowing for a much larger concentration of market share for the bigger hospital systems, which in the long term will not be good for anybody in the US if you're a consumer of healthcare services. The opportunity that's presented here in terms of switching gears and using healthcare professionals who are about to lose or have lost their jobs is a no-brainer. It's the contact tracing industry should be thriving in the US, and yet we're looking around and almost nobody's doing it, when we know from the experience of countries that have successfully tackled the pandemic early on are the countries who did massive testing and very aggressive contact tracing and isolation and quarantining. And in the US, we're not even close to scaling up those capabilities. And who's better prepared, equipped, positioned to do this than people who are already in the healthcare industry, who already have professional skills and the right kind of intuition to quickly go into intensive training and jobs in the contact tracing space. And this is just one obvious massive potential job creation that will, number one, help the economic situation, and number two, help the public health crisis, which in turn will allow us to reopen with the right precautions and so on. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to jump in with other comments later.
Okay. So Scott, how about you? Your specialty is jobs and analyzing jobs and employment and unemployment. And we've seen crises before. And in the 1930s, we put in place massive programs and policies to do that. So like Eileen Leff, who's in the audience, asked, what are elements of models for jobs development? Any thoughts on that?
Well, you could have asked Fadl that one too. Let's see. Well, I was going to go a totally different direction, but I'll try this one. So, yeah, I mean, we've presented a few times over the last 4 months an alternative indicator of unemployment, and the basic thing going on there that we've seen forever is that the official unemployment rate leaves out all kinds of people who want to work or want to work more. Because, well, if they're working, it leaves them out, because if you worked 1 hour, you're counted as employed, even if you wanted to work more. but it leaves out people who weren't looking, actively looking. There's actually different definitions of looking that they use in the survey. It leaves out people who weren't actively looking for jobs that don't exist, because we don't create enough jobs for all the people that want to work or want to work more. And we've never created enough jobs for that. So, excuse me. So the solution is that this requires the public sector, basically. I mean, it's interesting. We're talking about green jobs in the private sector. We end up on the public sector here, but it's largely about things that can be done to help the private sector, right? Because the private sector, of course, employs the vast majority of people, and there's more of a buffer stock role to be played here by the government. But the private sector, they're made up of non-loss organizations, as I like to call them. By design, at some point, they have to stop hiring, even if they really want to do good and hire people and worry about their own bottom line, right? That's just the nature of it, right? Nothing wrong with that. And so it'll always be a coincidence if you get enough jobs for the number of people that want jobs. Precisely because at the limit businesses, that's not what they are. That's not what they have a financial constraint. They have a financial survival constraint that they have to pay attention to. Mm-hmm. And then if we bring this into the context of resilience, you hit the same sort of financial constraint issues, because yes, we can have more resilient businesses with higher HIP scores and things like that, as we were looking at. But it also has its limits, right? That the redundancies and the sorts of things that we see that are necessary are the sorts of things that are additional costs to businesses. And at some point, that should be the public sector's job to be taking care of that. Because if it's a public policy goal to get it done, then if it's an additional cost for a non-loss organization, at some point you're going to need somebody else to do it.
Got it. Okay. So Kurt, you were called out like South Korea earlier. Are there other models or elements of models in countries? Because South Korea is actually one of those that's proposing forms of a Green New Deal as well.
Yeah. Well, Germany would be another good example. But if I could, I'd like to segue and build off of Bottle and Scott's point, if I may.
Sure.
It's really if I can, it's a bimodal impact. Many of the people listening are probably professionals. The professional class around the world is feeling far less pain than the people that are not, if you will, part of the professional class, which are heavily people that are on the front lines dealing with customers. Waitresses and waiters in restaurants, flight attendants on airlines, whatever the industry, the people that tend to have the low paid positions are disproportionately feeling the impact. And if you look at the data, it's not the social distancing that destroyed the jobs. People stopped going to restaurants, at least here in this country, before the social distancing because they were afraid for their own health and their own safety. And if we want to help bring the economy back, it's not just contact tracing because it's medically good and it creates jobs, Svatl. Go beyond that. It gives consumers confidence that they can actually engage in commercial activity, which will begin to bring back the demand, to Scott's point, that these non-loss businesses see it in their self-interest to hire employees and bring people back. Otherwise, all of the things we've been talking about, the gap between the rich and the poor, if anything, this is immensely exacerbating that problem.
And Kurt, you have a sort of a story based in Ohio. Fadl's also based in Ohio, outside of Columbus, at Denison University with the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. What happened in Ohio when you were based there, Kurt?
Oh, yeah, sure. Fadl, I was chairman of the Workforce Policy Board of Montgomery County down near Dayton back when the late Governor Voinovich passed the Ohio Supplemental Welfare Reform Policy. It's a wonderful experience. We got business, labor, churches, academia, healthcare, civic organizations, and the government to all work together to reduce unemployment and poverty. And we had immensely successful results. And I give the late governor a lot of credit for giving us the flexibility to implement something. I take very little credit, even though as a leader of the organization, I took over programs that others had designed, so I take no credit for the designs. But we had people, we had a 40-person board, and I would get consensus votes on major decisions, because once you build a sense of success, people want to be part of that success, and people are willing to give from their parochial interest because they have confidence that the good will outweigh what they're giving up in their parochial interest. And so we had civil service employees who are willing to make compromises on job rules, and unions that are willing to bend contracts, and employers who are willing to do things that they'd never thought of before and never would consider. So for example, there were companies that had layoffs where we as a county organization would come in and run a job fair in the facility of the employer for all the people who were being laid off. And in a couple of cases, we were able to get people jobs within the same week that they were laid off. And so I think there are creative ways that it's not that the government does something, but it's the cliche public-private partnerships. If you can get the forces to work together, really magical, really powerful, good things can occur.
Okay, so there's lots of things we can do. Are there things we can do first, like in 2020 versus 2021 or 2022? Like what would be elements of like a jobs creation program or a jobs retraining? Thoughts?
I put Fadl's suggestion on getting contact tracing in place. Yes, what's the number of jobs? 50, 100,000 jobs across the country overnight? Because not only will that employ people, that'll also start giving people confidence. Now, in parallel, we got to fix the testing issue. It takes a week to turn around a COVID test. Contact tracing is pretty useless.
Yeah, and this is just one example. I mean, one of the things that we should have done and could have done on a larger scale over the last few months is taking care of elderly people. So wellness checks, which can be done safely, remotely, or even in person with proper social distancing. And this is something that workers in the elderly care industry have been reporting being overwhelmed and stressed out. And this is the most impactful thing we can do for an elderly person is checking on them, especially during the pandemic. There's a huge need for mental health services that has been amplified during the pandemic. So in terms of thinking of what these pandemic type of shocks would require and planning ahead and thinking about jobs training and educational programs that could be building for that type of job creation. The shutdown has been, a fantastic opportunity for, weatherizing buildings that have been empty, for, installing rooftop solar, and these are all industries that are more resilient, that pay better, and that allow us to be even more resilient when we reopen. In terms of the confidence issue that Kurt was referring to, and not only contact tracing will help us build that confidence that we are better prepared at isolating cases and so on, but also think of the level of confidence I would have knowing that there is a much more rigorous health and sanitation standards and inspections being implemented, because you always worry going to, at least I do, you always worry eating out, pre-pandemic, let alone now. So boosting the health and sanitation standards across the board is also part of the job creation. But then thinking of the opportunities in the private sector too, and we've seen this happen over the last few months, which is a significant shift towards telehealth, and that requires digital infrastructure, that requires digital capabilities, also not just for the providers, but also for people at home, which means broadband access and things of that sort. So in terms of the skills and the job creation needed to make that a standard thing, not only delivering healthcare to people who can afford it, but delivering healthcare to people who have been excluded, pre-pandemic from access to healthcare. This is the opportunity. So it requires, engineering and programming skills. These are the short-term training programs that could have been taking place the last 3 months to produce a small army of young programmers and young engineers and technicians who could build this new engine for the economy to bring more resilient and more inclusive economic and public health infrastructure. And you start, and this is just off the top of my head, there's a whole bunch of other things that can be done to build this resilience. And as a result, the metric that we're looking at, the HIP and green jobs metric that Amir presented today, is the empirical kind of blueprint that tells us here's what your economy will look like if you shift the number of jobs and occupations and industries from low ranking HIP scores, from high contact industries to low contact industries, more digital, more green, more better paying industries. So again, back to this idea of designing a new engine as opposed to restarting the new engine. And unfortunately, this is a mistake that we keep repeating. For example, in the 2008 financial crisis, when you go back and look at all the major public policy discussions was, how do we restart the engine of the economy? Literally, I'm not making this up. And what is the engine of the economy? How do we get banks to go back to lending? How do we get consumers to go back to borrowing? And this massive debt deflation moment is getting to a higher debt to income ratio for consumers. That was supposed to be the solution to ending the crisis. And now we're talking about the same thing, reopening and going back without having addressed any of this, any of the underlying public health issues.
If I could, let me add a third. Sorry, Scott, just real quick. The other thing we kept on talking about, shovel ready, which was somehow to suggest building more roads. Let's build the new backbone of the grid, which we have this old, archaic, unmanageable electric grid that is not ready to handle the level of renewable energy that we want to put online. That's a much better use of shovels. Sorry to jump in, Scott.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I'll just pile on
perfect.
there. Last year during the wildfires, the investment philosophy that we started talking about at the investment committee with HIP Investor and Sonoma Private Wealth and New Day Investing was massively decentralized self-sufficiency. So massively decentralized self-sufficiency is grow your own food, generate your own energy, figure out how you can be self-sufficient on healthcare, build your life around this self-sufficiently, which we did, tens of thousands of years ago. And now we've built these ecosystems a lot in cities to be reliant. And in California here, where, we do have a 3-hour drive to 10% of the food supply in the US. So this incentivizing self-sufficiency, decentralization with appropriate centralized structures. And so, yeah, so Scott, over to you, and Amir, if you have anything that you're seeing in the jobs report that supports these points too.
Actually, I was going in a slightly different direction, just sort of echoing what's been said. We're starting to see it already, as Fadl was saying, which is we're starting to hear a discussion about multiplier effects of stimulus programs. And that was, again, part of the mistake we made in 2008, 2009, right? That was a crisis of too much debt in the household sector. And how do you get the household sector spending more? You probably help them fix their balance sheets rather than worry about the bang for the buck in the short run, right? And this crisis isn't a debt crisis, but it's a crisis of the day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year financial survival constraint of a household, and particularly small business sectors and even some larger businesses. And so the idea that what we just need to do is find the highest multiplier spending to get ourselves out of this is going to be wrong again, or that we need interest rates to be lower and negative or whatever to get out of this, right? I like to say if we go to NIRP, negative interest rate policy, what we'll find ourselves doing is going from NIRP to NIRPier, because you do negative interest rates to get out of this and everybody borrows. What's going to happen in the next one? Because you still haven't fixed balance sheets. You still haven't fixed financial positions of the household and business sectors.
And
So
basically you're giving money to those who don't need it, right? Which creates other asset bubbles elsewhere in the system.
Yeah, and if you give somebody money and they pay off their debt with it, that's not a bad thing right now, right? They make their mortgage payments with it, whatever, right? That's not a high multiplier thing, but that's survival right now. And what we need to do is allow them to survive and to do even better than that. And yeah, I'm getting away from the green job stuff. I'm much more of a general level, so I'll stop there.
Amir, are you seeing anything in the jobs data related to these trends?
Well, what I wanted to comment on specifically was the points of how readily, like, there are jobs even that can be created like overnight that are not just, you know, luxury jobs or something that we sort of need. It would be something that can extremely benefit the situation in and of itself. So first, you know, with Fado's point in terms of how many people could we employ and who are willing to work, in terms of that could be seen from the would you take a job measure. You know, we have, and it's all three of these pieces coming together. So, you know, that would be extremely beneficial. I really enjoyed, you know, the emphasis on mental health in terms of like how it can, as a society, help us perform better and even, you know, go about our daily lives in a better fashion, but also in terms of hitting all corners of the economy and creating a foundation. The amount of work that would be needed in terms of providing the infrastructure needed for the renewable energy, as Kurt was saying, would just be spurious, right? It would create an extreme foundation, extreme inflow of jobs that, you know, would be needed to maintain, like this infrastructure would need to be maintained. And from that, from my point of terms of creating indirect jobs. So it's a cascading effect on a solid foundation rather than relying on old, I guess, like archaic and outdated methods that we use to run the economy.
Great. All right. So we're unfortunately at time. We always have more content than we can squeeze in the available time. So I want to thank all of our panelists, Kurt Lieberman, CEO of Magnite Global, Amir Khalegi, student at University of Missouri, Kansas City, budding economist and soon to be PhD. Dr. Scott Fullweiler, also at University of Missouri, Kansas City, economics guru, and Dr. Fadel Kaboub at Denison University, also economics and green jobs guru, and head of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. So Nigel's gonna summarize with some good news, and I'll come back for a preview of next week.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. And look, once again, I think that was a fascinating discussion and one that's filled with positive things that we can all do. I thought I'd wrap up very quickly. Firstly, with this is not an economist summary. This is more of a kind of business or government policy summary, which is, if we follow this kind of path, then the jobs we're creating are in lots of ways just simply better jobs. They are more resilient. They are better paid from an investment point of view and from an economic point of view. In many ways, the activities involved are lower risk, and the risk-return trade-off from an investor point of view is also good. So there's a simple what's not to like in all of this kind of conclusion. I think the other thing which really struck me from this discussion was, there is plenty of low-hanging fruit. We're not talking about complicated complicated things which require lots of investment. Certainly there will be some of those, but some of the opportunities can be implemented rapidly and realized quickly. Another part of this is whilst some of this is like addressing COVID testing is not necessarily a long-term thing, many of the other areas line up with long-term developments in the economy and in society, and hence are good things to be doing because you're betting on the future, not on trying to preserve the past. And I can't remember who said this, the point that this is not a win-lose thing. These are opportunities where everybody can benefit from pursuing these types of investments and this type of change. So with that, I will hand back to Paul. Just a reminder to everyone, please do share with everyone in your networks, post on social media, subscribe on YouTube to get these messages out more broadly. It is a team sport, and our audience here is now from over 50 countries. So everyone's help in pushing these messages wider is greatly appreciated. So thank you very much, and I will pass back to Paul.
Great, thank you, Nigel. Appreciate our partnership and ongoing hosting from Pottinger and Hip Investor. And thank you, Nick Gower, for producing us into a smooth, highly professional flow. Next week on ESGX, we're going to have a focus on commercial real estate and how to build green buildings, building green communities. And that'll be led by Bruce Kahn, who some of you may know, who's a leader in the impact investing industry. And we have a diverse panel, both by gender and ethnicity and race, but also by specialty. So please join us on August 4th. And on August 11th, we'll have Steve Gadecki and Sarah Cleveland with a panel focused on how to implement impact investing. And then on August 18th, we'll have the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, giving women an opportunity to vote that they had to fight for decades, to fight for equality. And then at the end of August, we will have a Green Jobs Report for August 2020. So please send your ideas for future content and panelists. This is meant to inform, educate, and spur us to take more action, coordinated action, and intelligent action. Of course, you can always go to the esgx.org site if you want to rewatch or replay or share this content. As Nigel said, please share, post, like, or subscribe. We have a deep well of content here for how to take action and build a better world and build stronger, higher impact portfolios. So on behalf of Nigel Lake, my co-host, and me, Paul Herman of Hip Investor, look forward to seeing you on the next ESGX.